I find it almost hard to believe that after nearly a year of doing videos for this channel, I have yet to review the very first Albion sword that I've owned. Actually, a sword that I've used for HEMA, and I can't believe it's taken me this long to get to it. But I figured it's about time that I review the Albion Liechtenauer. This sword exhibits the handling characteristics of the swords used in Liechtenauer's Manual of Armored Fencing, Kampffechten or Harnischfechten, as recorded in the Codex 1449 manuscript compiled by Peter von Danzig in 1452, Danzig's Fechtbuch. This sword would also be suitable for practice of the techniques illustrated in the manuals of Talhofer, Ringek, and Fiore. This sword is a suitable practice equivalent for the Albion Next Generation Ringek, Talhofer, Fiore, Sempak, Landgraf, Regent, and Earl. The sword features rounded edges, stainless steel hilt components, and a treated cord-wrapped grip. Part of the Maestro line, this new line of sparring swords has been designed by Swedish researcher, author, and swordsmith Peter Johnson to specifically fill the need for sword types that handle like those covered in period fencing books. These swords are made to meet the demanding requirements of Western martial artists and stage combat, built to endure years of hard use. Here are the specifications of the Albion Liechtenauer. And of course, I will note that this sword holds up to a lot of abuse, as can be seen in this video featuring John Clements. Simple and rugged. There's really no better way to describe any of the swords in Albion's Maestro line, and more specifically the Liechtenauer here, but it really is very aesthetically simple. That's okay. This is meant to be uber functional, and when we get to the functionality part of the review, that'll bear out a lot more. Now, what I will say is that I am at least a little bit appreciative that they took the time to add at least a little bit of detailing to the hilt components of this sword. More specifically, here at the cross, they did some really simple file lines, so it breaks up what could be a very monotonous crossguard. And of course, the pommel has a nice design to it. It looks all right. Of course, everything I've ever said about Albion swords will apply. Good, simple, clean lines, very solid construction. Really nothing to say negative about the aesthetics of this sword. Well, maybe except for the handle. The twine-wrapped handle that is left that way, it's alright. It's, again, this is not meant for aesthetics, but that could at least be a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. When you look at any of the leather wrapping that they do with their other swords, they're just so beautiful. But I can also understand that, again, this cuts down on costs, and it's one of those things that it's alright. It gives you a good grip, and sometimes that's what you need. So sacrificing aesthetics a little bit more for functionality. Overall, aesthetically, it's a good sword, but as we get into the functionality section, we're going to see why this sword is actually very, very good. As with any time I'm going to review anything that I utilize for HEMA, functionality is going to be the most important thing I will talk about. And of course, for a practice sword, that's going to certainly be no exception. So while the aesthetics is kind of a thing I can deal without, the functionality really has to be there. And I think that this sword performs superbly in pretty much every practical area of functionality. There are a few things that are negative about it that I'll get into in a moment. But I want to speak first and foremost about construction, materials, and really, I mean, I've said it before about Albion products, but they are supremely put together. The construction is just great, and I love how good it feels in the hand. I feel that these are very reliable swords. I've spoken a lot recently about swords that could break, and that's true for anything, but I really do feel like these are all very, very reliable products. And I'm very, very happy with the materials they use. Even though they're using stainless steel for the cross, that's alright, because the blade is, of course, high quality. Now, in terms of functionality of use, one of the things I really love about the way Albion has approached their Maestro line of swords is that they offer analogs. So I own the Ringek. I've done a review before on it, and this sword is an analog for the Ringek, which means that if I use this sword in practice, it would be a lot like I was using the Ringek sword. And it's actually interesting. If I were to take this sword and close my eyes and hold it out in front of me, the only indicator I really have in terms of feel is actually, well, it's actually the wrapping, because it's not leather. But the weight of this feels pretty much identical. And in fact, I talked about it a lot in my Ringek review, that it actually feels pretty heavy in the hand when you're holding it with one hand. But as soon as you add that second hand and you add that little bit of extra leverage, it really lightens the perceived weight of the sword, I guess is the word I want to look for, the perceived, because it's still a pretty heavy sword, at least for basic sword standards, but it feels very, very agile, very light when you've got two hands on it, which is to be expected when you're talking about a long sword that you're going to be using with two hands anyway. Overall, I think that from construction and functionality standpoints, these are great. It's an Albion. I couldn't give it higher marks. However, I think one of the negative aspects of the Albion lines currently, very more specifically the Liechtenauer and also their Meyer sword, which is Albion's version of a fader, is that they haven't necessarily been kind of universally accepted in HEMA tournaments. In fact, if you look at a lot of the rules for HEMA tournaments out there, in the past at the very least, you will see that the Meyer and the Liechtenauer are specifically called out as swords that are not allowed. I think that has a lot to do with this right here, the tip, because the tip it's rounded, but it's not rolled, and I think that offers some a little bit of concern for officials and people within the HEMA circuits, that it might be a little bit too likely that because it's not rolled, it could injure someone. Additionally, the edge of these blunt longswords is not nearly as thick as you would see in more traditional fader designs. I think about my Reginier fader, which has a very, very thick edge on it, almost twice as thick as the edge that's on this blunt longsword. So there are definitely some concerns that people have in terms of keeping other people safe when you're using it to spar and practice, and I think those are valid concerns, something that Albion maybe should think about. But overall, I believe that I'm beginning to see a trend where these are actually now becoming more accepted. There are usually some requirements that are put on people who are going to use these type of swords. Some, I think, actually require that you put little leather end caps or rubberized end caps on the tip to make sure that it's safe. But overall, it's slowly becoming more accepted in the tournament scenes. But until it's there, until it's universally accepted, and until Albion is making versions of these swords that kind of address the concerns that people have, then it's not going to be quite as functional within the HEMA practice that I'd really want it to be. I'd really want this to be universally acceptable, and when it's not quite as useful. And I think that's partially problematic because my Reginier fader is pretty much universally accepted, so it's actually more usable. But this is such a good practice sword. I love this thing. So well constructed, so nice in the hand. I just love Albions. But it's a little bit disappointing that I feel like I can't really utilize it nearly as much as I'd want to. Another thing that's actually kind of a drawback, although this is minor, is that when you pair this specific longsword by Albion up to other longswords, and I'm thinking to a sword that I have yet to review, but I'll probably review it very soon, which is my Hanwei Tinker blunt longsword. There's really no comparison. The quality of the materials in the Albion line shows through very well when you actually begin to use those swords. Even in light practice, you will see the blade of your opponent's sword become very marred, while there's almost no indication that you've even used this sword. And because of that, I've actually used this sword less in my HEMA practices because I'm worried about damaging other people's swords. I really just don't want to do that. So I'm able to put that aside and use a sword that's a little bit more on par with some of the other less expensive swords and swords that use, I don't want to really say lesser materials, but definitely different materials with different tempering and hardening practices being put into place. So overall, yeah, it's a good functional sword, but as I'll cover in my conclusion section, overall it's not perfect. As I spoke to with all the functionality stuff, obviously you can see that, and we'll speak about that just here in a moment. The conclusion here is going to be very, very short. Ultimately, this is a wonderful sword. Its aesthetics take a backseat to the functionality, and the functionality, at least from a practical standpoint, is totally there. Great construction, great materials, just a beautiful sword to handle. But ultimately, the drawbacks, the setbacks that I spoke to in terms of the inability to use this against other swords that may not have quite as good materials being used, as well as the fact that this is still very limited in use in terms of HEMA tournaments, really sets this sword back from where it really should be. And I can't give it nearly as high marks as I would really love to, because while it's practically functional, it's also not functional outside of just its own kind of sphere of influence. So here it is. This is the Albion Liechtenauer. I give it a 4 out of 5.